Our first speaker is Jade Haumann. She is a member of the Seneca Nation Wolf Clan. She is from the Onondaga Nation community and a graduate student at SUNY ESF, formerly studying ecology through a Haudenosaunee lens. Jade's master work embodies her passion for advocating for Indigenous sovereignty, healing human and land relations, and her love for community. The goal of her work is to articulate Haudenosaunee relationships to fire with specifics on how, why, where, and when. Ideally, this work can serve as a resource to consult in making community decisions on how to address climate change impacts. Welcome, Jade.
Welcome, Jade.
All right, Nuehaskano, everyone. I am Jade Haumann, and I'm so glad to see you all. So I'm going to be talking about Indigenous relationships to fire. And just as a little intro about me, I am a fire learner, by no means a fire expert. I will never want to be called a fire expert, so I want to begin with that. I am Haudenosaunee, so I am by blood Seneca from my mother's line, but I've been raised in the Onondaga community, which is another nation of the Haudenosaunee. I am also a graduate student at ESF, and I'm part of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, and this is my advisor, Dr. Madeline Nineblade, up here. So this is a little bit about me, super nerdy, love it. And just to give us a little bit more grounding about exactly where we are, this map, sorry, I don't know if you guys couldn't hear me then. This map is showing the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee communities, and you can see the vast land loss. And so that red circle is just kind of grounding us of the, very broad region of where we are. Sorry. There we go. Yeah, so you could just see, I just wanted to show the kind of the emphasis of how much land has been lost. And also to give some more referencing, so you might have seen this flag everywhere. This is the Haudenosaunee Hiawatha Belt. And so comparing that to the map I just showed you, you can see that this wampum belt actually shows where our territories are. So if you go in order on the map, you can see that each of those are represented in this flag. Sorry, I don't know why I keep skipping. But I just want to make sure everyone kind of gets that grounding first, because at any opportunity we all can learn more. So I really want to make sure everyone has this good understanding. And also, as a beginning point, I want to tell you this little story about snow. It kind of seems ironic talking about fire. But someone told me this really good analogy once, that not every year we get to go cross-country skiing. Sometimes the conditions aren't good, sometimes life happens and we're busy, but that doesn't mean that we don't cross-country ski. And that's the same thing about Indigenous fire. We may not see it every year, every day, it may not be on the news, but that doesn't mean that it isn't still active. In the long run of Indigenous histories, the timeline is so vast and so long. What we're experiencing right now is such a small little glimmer in that history. So I just want to really create this image in your head that this isn't past tense, this is something active, this is a living culture. And just like that, this is a really cool website. I encourage everyone to check it out. It's nativeland.ca, and you can put in any address and it can tell you exactly whose homelands you're on. And so I wanted to really put this out there to show you that there's so many different Indigenous cultures, and just like that there's that many Indigenous cultures, there's that many relationships to fire as well. Not every Indigenous relationship to fire is going to be the same, and so it's important that we honor that uniqueness of each culture. And I'm going to give you a few examples to talk about that difference and uniqueness. I like to say they're different people, different fires, but it's all a shared love. And so first we're going to talk about Haudenosaunee. And so we have a woodland, some grassland habitat that we live in. And this is how we have a relationship with fire. And so it's primarily utilitarian, I would say. So prioritizing traveling throughout our nations. We're a confederacy, so there's a lot of intermingling between our nations. Our pottery, which serves so many purposes, but pottery wouldn't be here without fire. creating these village sites, that was created through fire. This is all signs of our use of fire throughout the years. And also with our food. So a lot of different relationships to food, particularly like our gardening. You saw me holding up a braid of corn. We're big into agriculture. And so fire has a lot of good purposes with food and our fields, in the sense of clearing out all the old vegetation and all that messy material, but also providing more nutrients for the plants. So basically what we think is that everything we're taking out through that food, we want to give back. And so that's where fire comes in, and the ash, being able to feed the food that's feeding us. I give a few more examples here. So talking about berries. Berries are yummy for us, obviously, but they're also yummy for the food that we hunt, like the deer. And so this is a way of encouraging deer to come in areas that's a little bit easier for us to hunt, but also encouraging their populations to be healthy as well. And then thinking more about plants, talking about trees, especially with acorns and chestnuts. They're delicious, and they also have a really good fire relationship as well. And then moving a little central west on the continent, looking at the Blackfeet people. So they come from prairie lands, and so they have a different relationship, but it's the same ties to their food. In this way, the buffalo are huge in this. And so buffalo have a good relationship with fire in that they kind of feed fire in their own way with their little cow patties, or I should say, their big cow patties. So those cow patties, they love fire, they're a little torch. And so that encourages a fire behavior on their prairies, and that also encourages the plants that grow there. And so a lot of the native plants of these prairies rely on the scarification that happens through the fires. And so that's all part of the Blackfeet people's food, their life way. It all relies on that relationship to fire in the land. Now we're going to go a little coastal, talking about the West Coast with the Yuroks. And so their territory is more mountainous, forest with prairies mixed in. And fire has a huge relationship out there, as I'm sure we've all heard. But in ways I think not many people think about. So thinking about their water, their stream health, there's a relationship there with the ash running down the hills. And therefore impacting the salmon. They're huge fish people out there. They love fish. That's a huge part of their diet. And having that relationship with fire encourages those healthy fish populations. This is a beautiful basket on here. That basket wouldn't exist without fire either. So fire has an impact on food, regalia, childcare, all through basketry and then many uses. And then also similarly the acorns, fish, berries, and prairies, all encouraging the elk and deer, just like how I talked about with Haudenosaunee people. So now we're going to go into a little bit of a history lesson. This is just shared history, though, between Indigenous peoples and fire. So it's a history of suppression and vilification. I'm sure many of you have seen this photo, maybe recently. But this is the epitome of colonization. And so I'm going to ask you all to put on an Indigenous lens and look at this painting that I'm sure you all have seen in grade school and the history books, etc., etc. But look at it through an Indigenous lens. We see this idea of westward expansion, where it's the colonizers, the settlers moving west, and they're bringing the train, they're bringing this light, they're bringing the farming, this and that. But over here, it's very dark, it's very gloomy, it's scary, it looks chaotic, it looks inherently bad. But to me, this is what I'm seeing in not only the colonization and the assimilation of settler culture, but you're also seeing the erasure of fire. So this, once I started thinking about fire so intimately about everything in life, I saw that dark gloominess. I realized, I think that's smoke. That's Indigenous cultural fire. And so now you see the settlers trying to erase that culture of fire there. And also hand in hand, we got the gold rush. And so I'm sure a lot of you learned about the gold rush too. But what people don't think about, especially here in the East Coast, is how dangerous, how violent this time was. Especially for Indigenous cultures of the West Coast, this was a time of murder, of mass killings and just brutality by these settlers, because they saw the Indigenous people living on that land as a threat to their wealth, of this hope of gold, this little golden nugget, and to them they thought it was worth causing all this violent harm. And also, that also was directed at fire too. So indigenous cultures practicing their fire behavior, their fire practices, that was inherently bad to their prospects for gold, because that put their villages at risk, their campsites. And so then there's a lot of accounts where they actually shot the indigenous people for being on their own land, of practicing their own culture, of maintaining that relationship to land through fire. And then shortly after that, residential schools. And so residential schools thrived for a very unfortunate long time. And in this period, the churches in the United States and the Canadian governments had this movement of assimilation, and it's basically this attempt to wipe out indigenous cultures. And so in these residential schools, they would take children forcefully and with manipulative tactics, and take the children away from their families, their communities, their culture, from the land. And so to the people, to the culture, it's pretty obvious the harm that can cause. But thinking of it of a fire lens, that's this many people, this many children, generations that aren't learning the ways of fire on the land. And so this was happening from 1860 to 1996. Our people are still facing the implications of these schools and what that has done to our families. But thinking about fire, we lost a lot of the practices being so regular, of the little details of the why, when, where, how, because we weren't learning those things when all of our ancestors were in the school being forced away from the land like that. And now I want to move on to Smokey Bear. I'm sure we all are very familiar with Smokey Bear here in the Adirondacks. So this was a campaign started by the U.S. Forest Service in 1944. And I think a lot of people don't realize that this actually has militaristic ties, as it was started during the era of World War II. And the idea was that there was a lack of men to be able to fight these fires. And so now, similarly to what I was talking about with the gold rush, there's a threat to value of these assets. So the lumber industry, all these profits that people were seeing in the woods was now a threat, with fires coming in. And so any kind of fire, any little tiny spark was a huge risk to that, because they didn't think that there was enough adequate support to be able to protect the forest and be able to protect their assets. And so that's when the Smokey Bear campaign came up, and at the same time we're thinking about, what is that doing to the forest? Well, there's a buildup of forest debris then. If there aren't regular maintenance and relationships to the fire, then you have that much more of leaf litter and twigs and all this dead dry material building up, and that's just going to make a much bigger fire. But thinking about it too in an indigenous lens, what's also happening at this very important time is that boarding schools are in strong swing at this point. So now there's tons of indigenous cultures, communities that are they're suffering. They're facing the reality of the boarding schools, missing a lot of their community members, their youth, their family members. And so we're in that point, as well as a strict Indian law. At this point in U.S. history, it was illegal to practice any indigenous culture, whether that's ceremony or even land management practices, including fire. So through an indigenous lens, this is going to be a little shaky for some, but through an indigenous lens, this is truly a campaign of discrimination, ignorance, and misinformation. And you can go on Smokey Bear website, and they have all this giant catalog of all the advertisements ever used for this campaign. And you can see how twisted it was in the very beginning. It was teaching generations to fear fire in weird ways too. So this video shows a whole troop of Boy Scouts dressed up as Indians at the time, and they're singing God Bless America. Also very ironic, misinformed. But this is them encouraging a very negative relationship with fire, to fear fire, that all fire is bad. So in this one ad, this short ad, they're targeting children, and they're teaching cultural ignorance, cultural appropriation, culture suppression. This one's just really weird. I just like showing it just because I want to show everyone. Hopefully the sound comes on.
I know a place that's peaceful and quiet, a place where animals play. It's called the forest, but every year we start forest fires. A careless match or cigarette and poof, fire. So the next time you're in the forest, be extra careful, okay?
If you knew it was me, would you have listened?
Yeah. They really pulled out the big guns for this campaign. And so you can also see an early disconnect to nature. And so in 1950, there was this bear cub that was injured in a wildfire in New Mexico. And for some reason, they thought it would be a good idea or even somehow rationalized to take this living bear and become a living symbol of Smokey Bear. And this poor cub was then dragged around all around the country as a living entity, dressed up with little hats, little cute outfits, to advocate for the forest somehow, even though this cub was stolen from his family, from his community, from his land. And so this is just a very unfortunate point in time for the history of fire and just wildlife. So now we're done with the history lesson. Now I want to go into a little bit clarification of what is a prescribed burn and what is a cultural burn. So a prescribed burn is a little bit more nitty-gritty with the paperwork. It's usually agency-led, a lot of government regulations and certifications, very strict conditions to burn. Just like when you go to a doctor, you have strict conditions to be able to be prescribed a medication, hopefully. And that's the same thing with fire. So there's lots of paperwork, there's limitations around who can participate, who can even be around the fire. And there's very specific gear, the Nomex, the bright yellow, the bright green. It's a huge fashion statement. And then the chemical ignition, which you see here in the torch, which is usually a mixture of diesel and gas. And now a cultural burn. This is different for all indigenous communities, like I said, but generally culturally led objectives, so that can be something around plants, food, whatever it may be. Sometimes there's ceremonial protocol, meaning they're looking for land consent and they're going to respect that land consent. And what I mean by that is if you're going to a site that you intend on burning that day and you set that intention, you take that moment to really connect to the land. Maybe you see a bird's nest, animals that aren't able to flee like they normally would at the right age. That's a time to not burn. That's your sign to move on, maybe do somewhere else, or just come back another time. Natural matches, so you can see this torch on the bottom. So trying to avoid the chemicals as much as possible. Community-based, multi-generation. This is a photo I took on a burn out in California, and you can see the children here. They were actually the ones that started our fire that day. It was very beautiful, and they're there with their grandmother, their mother, their father, who was all part of our team that day. And you can see, I mean, they're wearing kids' clothes. They're not in like crazy protective gear. They're also using mugwort as a torch, so that's a natural medicine that started our fire. This is a really good quote that I really like from Frank Lake. If you're interested in indigenous fires, I highly encourage you checking out Frank Lake's work. And so he said, I brought my kids on that burn, and I did so because we are people of the fire. If we don't get out there and see fire, how are we going to be knowledgeable and active community members in the future? And this is me with my own stepchild right here. And this is a baby carrying basket made out of hazel shoots. Another direct tie to fire. And this is, that basket is a style from the Yuroks out in Northern California. And so what I mean by fire is family is just thinking about the nurturing side of fire, how much fire does to care for us. So as indigenous people, a lot of communities have baby carrying baskets. And so you can see this baby being held in a basket that literally wouldn't exist without fire. I can't emphasize that enough. So thinking about the foods that grow because of fire, thinking about the food that is safe to eat because of fire, also keeping us warm, keeping us sheltered out of dangerous weather, and also medicines. Our first medicines that all the doctors and pharmacies use now, they all derive from plant medicines. And a lot of those plant medicines don't survive without fire, or that's how you make them, is with fire. And so I like throwing up this little graphic to make it a little more sciencey. And so in this way, it's talking about kind of like the mosaic sense of land, so having different stages of life for land. And so this is what they call secondary succession, and you can see each stage kind of having like a restart and then going to the next step. Just like we generally do as people, we keep growing in life. And this is what I mean by a shared history for land and Indigenous people. So with the vilification of fire and fire suppression, it's almost like the assimilation tactics that were used on Indigenous people. They wanted to make all Indigenous people the same and into this settler format. And so that's kind of the same thing that happened with fire. Taking out fire, then you erase this whole mosaic section of land and it becomes all one giant monoculture. And so just creating those similarities and seeing where those things overlap. Assimilation. So where are we heading? You see giant photos like this, film and all that on the news, very scary. So this is what they call low frequency, high intensity. And what this phrasing means is that there's these high impact forest fires that are just massive. That's what we see on the news. It's very scary. It's taken over everything. Well, we used to not hear about this a lot. Now we are obviously seeing this a lot more. This is low frequency. And so this is natural in a lot of cases. Over time immemorial, you'll see giant forest fires like this. It just happens sometimes. It's just at that time there weren't houses and people living in those areas. And alternatively, there's high frequency, low intensity fires, and that's typically what a prescribed burn, cultural burn is aiming at. And so you see nice, slow and controlled fire on the ground and not much fuel to eat up there because ideally this is happening more frequently so that there isn't that giant fuel load building up. So what does that mean about cultural impact? This is a burn I was on in February, also in California. And so this community uses these red sour berries to build their baby baskets and a lot of their other basketry material. And so that's typically what we were burning out there for through that cultural objective. And you can see on the far right is a recently burned site. You can see those really nice straight shoots that looks very nice to be crafty with, to flex and create these baby cradles, right? But then without fire, you see this tangled mess where it's a nightmare to get through there. You cannot walk through there. It's awful. But then if you think about if there's no fire at all, obviously you get this tangled mess, but that is going to go up so quickly in fire. So with these massive fires, it'll have so much heat that it's just going to scorch everything. That this healthy picture on the right saying all these healthy shoots, that's not going to happen for a while because when you have massive wildfires like that, you're scorching everything, and that includes the soil and the soil health. And you don't have that healthy community in the soil to be able to support the seeds to restart the next community of plants. And so thinking about thinking about the baby cradle I just showed you, imagine if that happened everywhere constantly, and there weren't these slow and controlled burns to maintain these patches that they need to make those baby cradles. That means those grandmas, the moms making those baskets aren't going to be able to give that to the next generation. But that also means they're not going to be able to show the next generation of how to make those baskets. And that is devastating to even think about. This is one of my old slides. I used to show this since 2023, and I would always say, why does this matter? We're in New York. No one ever thinks about fire. And this was happening that very summer. The smoke from 2023 when the fires in Canada were impacting us here. I was in Syracuse at the time, so I would say here in Syracuse, now we're seeing it. But now it's just kind of a funny reminder thinking like that was the first big takeaway for me of being like, wow, this is coming for us. This is our new reality with climate change. And now since then, I could throw up a bazillion other news screenshots like that in our local region. Even in Syracuse, this past March, we had our own wildfire. And I remember that exact day of how chaotic it was, how unprepared our community was. Our structural firefighters had no idea what was even burning. I remember hearing their calls and just saying, yeah, the weeds are growing. It was Phragmites. They were Phragmites that were like 15 feet tall, and they were just like, yeah, these weeds just won't stop burning. But if they knew exactly what to do, if they were wildland chained, this would be handled in no time. But this went on far, far into the night. I believe it caught sometime in the early evening, late evening maybe, and it went on until sundown, and it was dark, and there were 30-foot flames that reached really close to our housing in Syracuse. Who would have ever thought that in Syracuse, that this is going to be our reality? But it is, and so this is what I'm encouraging, is that we need to keep talking about this. This is our new life. These are just some fun pictures I want to scroll through really quick. because most people don't think of this. This is Albany. So it looks very cool. It looks like a little safari, but this is a very fire-dependent community. And there's a few other patches like this throughout New York. There's one in Rome as well, and these like sand dunes. But fortunately, there are groups that are placing good fire on the ground again, and you can see that. So I talk about my experience burning out in California. I've had some experience in Kansas as well, a little bit more western communities, but I just want to emphasize that this is New York as well. This is this region. Sorry, I don't know how to get off this video now. Thank you.
Yeah, it was doing that for me before too. Sorry. Range.
Anyway, I hope you guys like all my fire pictures. I've been adding as many as I can. I have way too many on my camera roll, so this gives me a good excuse to use them all. Pretty much all the photos that are on my slides are photos I've taken throughout the years on different burns I've been on.
On this one.
Yep.
Got it.
Thank you.
Of course.
Do I just hit this?
Would help if everyone could see what you had.
So talking about Albany, this community is very specific to this very pretty butterfly. It's a federally endangered Carner blue butterfly, and that has a very great relationship to the plants right next to here, the lupine, who also depend on the fire. So this is just really pretty. It's a really cool ecosystem. I encourage you all to visit if you can. And talking more about Indigenous history, so this is a Seneca village site, Onondaga, which is now a state park, and it's a really good cultural center. They teach a lot about our Seneca traditions back then and now, and they have this great little demo, thing, and you can see that this first section is a burned forest, and then further back is an unburned forest, and so you can see it's very dense. It looks pretty impossible to drive through, walk through, whatever, and you can also see the wide open prairie spaces, as well as our burned agricultural fields. And Onondaga is still burning to this day, and so this was their first time going into the woods, which was really great in a long time. And really cool photos. Like I said, I love using this as an excuse. And showing a little bit different styles of burning. So this is another cultural fire I was on out in California with the Norfolk Mono tribe, and they were doing pile burning right in the woods. So essentially thinking about kind of like a bonfire, but in the middle of the woods, which is pretty unheard of and maybe scary, but it was fine, and this is part of their norm. So I want to wrap up by saying, what can you do? This is a lot of information I threw at you, a lot of history, a lot of cool pictures, hopefully, but I want to leave you with something to really think on. And first of that is being the influence of language, of how we talk about fire, specifically with all the firefighting and etc. It's a lot of vilification if you really think about the words that we use or that we see in media. And thinking about disturbance. Disturbance kind of has this connotation that it's something really bad and it's something to avoid at all costs. But when you think about it, disturbance is flooding. Disturbance is a relationship. It's interacting with the ecosystem. And fire is a disturbance, that's true. But that doesn't mean it's always a bad thing. So this is a really good quote that kind of puts that in perspective for you. This is also a wetland burning from Florida. And I also want to put that in your minds that water habitats also burn. So wetlands, marshes, they also have a relationship to fire. So when a frequent disturbance is the norm, removing that disturbance is then disruptive. Again, wanted to really drive that in, that wetlands do burn. And what else can you do? Be in relationship. So this is my own property back home in Onondaga. The woods behind my house have been untouched for a long time. A lot of dead pines, and that's just what the farmer had planted to grow really quick. But now we're in a time where they're all just dying off, and I'm at a huge risk for fire. Obviously, I can't just set fire in there. It can be crazy. It's close to my house. It's a giant torch in there, essentially. And so what I did was really cool in this... It's the before and after. You can kind of see we're halfway through the woods right now, so it's kind of cool. You kind of go like this, and that's the right image, and then you go to the other side, and that's the very hard to walk through, like tangled mess image. So hopefully the rest of my woods will look really nice soon. But the way I did that was being in community. And so for my birthday party, I was really nerdy, and I invited a lot of my friends over, and we cleared out the woods, and we had a big bonfire all night long because we had so much fuel. And it was a really great time, and I just really encourage that everyone have a relationship with the land. It feels so good. It's so healing for you and the community around you, both animals, plants, people alike. Thinking about animals, this is the bobwhite quail, and this is another really good example of being in relationship with the land. So these guys are kind of more down south Georgia area, and they couldn't figure out why they were doing so bad for so long until they realized their habitat depended on fire. And because of fire suppression laws and tactics, they weren't having that fire relationship to the land to create the habitats they needed. And so with that, their populations really dwindled. And so you can kind of see this whole pipeline of demise for these poor bobwhite quails. But then they figured it out, and they got fire back in the land. They're doing really good now. So I just want to leave this message saying disturbance is enriching. And the background image is a very fun fact. It is a national park, and it's the first national park to have a prescribed burns. This is the Everglades. And so a lot of people don't think about that with fire, so I always like throwing that little fun fact in. And also, I recently heard this story about kind of the same mosaic habitat happening for the ruffed grouse here in the Adirondacks. This person I was speaking with recently, they were telling me how they have kind of this mosaic clear-cutting plan set where it's every, I want to say 15 years, they would clear-cut a section of X amount of acres, and then the ruffed grouse would depend on this one habitat of growth, maybe like 25-year-old growth for food, or maybe that was the habitat. And then the clear-cut area that had a lot of like herbs, a lot of seedy plants, and that would be their food source. So it's really interesting to see how this is also a disturbance-dependent community, and it's just that parallel between the bobwhite quail and the ruffed grouse. So I'm going to leave you with this. Continue to learn about fire. Continue to talk about fire. This is a really good documentary if anyone wants to see. Sorry, I know I'm in your way. These are some Indigenous women I work with out in California. They're incredible ladies doing incredible work out there. It's a short film, I want to say maybe an hour max, and I have the QR code if anyone would like to scan it. I think it would also be pretty cool to note right now that PBS was one of the supporters of the film. Just throwing that out there. Dance. All right. In my final little drive at home, I like to talk about this cat face analogy of resilience. And so thinking about fire, this is a cat face. So this is what happens when a tree has seen fire. It gets scarred, and it forms kind of this like healing wrapped edge of bark around the wound, and it kind of creates this little triangle. But to me, that's a really big lesson, and very similarly parallels with Indigenous histories. And so it's not that we can forget the past. It's not that we can ignore it. We have to acknowledge it, and we have to be able to grow around it and maybe create a little bit more protective areas around those wounds of our history, just like the tree does with its fire scars. And so with each generation, we're only going to grow that much stronger. We're going to grow that much more acknowledgement of that point in history. It's never going to be gone, and it's never going to be forgotten within our people. But we can move forward with it. And this is a cute little scene from Avatar: The Last Airbender of Hope. I'm also an Okie. I'm from ESF, so I got to throw in a little acorn joke in here. And so in this scene, the Fire Nation destroyed this community that Aang knew. He was very distraught. He was just so hopeless. And Katara comes over and gives him a little acorn and says, "These acorns are everywhere, Aang. That means the forest will grow back. Every one of these will be a tall oak tree someday, and all the birds and animals that lived here will come back." And all of a sudden, he has that hope again. So if I can leave you with anything, it's some hope and also some resources. So here's another QR code. This is some podcasts with really great fire practitioners that I've worked with in the past and also look up to. There's also the bullet points of the actual podcast if you don't want to do the QR code. There's just so many people out there talking about it now. So if there's anything you can do after this conference is do a little bit more research. Just look up Indigenous fire practitioners. There's a lot of articles, journals, and podcasts. So I am all finished. This is my contact information if you want to follow up. It always switches. Anyway, this is a really cool video of us firing a clay pot and just showing that demonstration. Yeah. So anyway,
Thank you so much, Jade. We're going to have you stay right here for a moment.